iOS 18 is the most important iPhone update in more than a decade. Alongside the visual tweaks and enhancements and Sherlocking of third-party apps you expect from an annual iOS refresh, the iPhone software for 2025 brings huge fundamental changes to the way you'll use your iPhone, and that's mostly all down to two letters: AI. And this being the iPhone, that A, of course, stands for Apple. Apple Intelligence is more than just the next generation of Siri. It's a warning shot across Google's bow at a time when the folks in Mountain View are still seen as struggling to compete with market leader OpenAI. And it's the closest the iPhone has come to date to eating Android's lunch when it comes to being a truly smart, personally aware AI OS. Google has been plugging away at smartphone AI for years, ever since its big company-wide pivot towards AI in 2018. But 6 years on, it feels like Apple has just made a substantial leap ahead. The scope of Apple Intelligence is pretty massive. It knows about you, the important people, locations, and things in your life, the context of what you're doing on your phone at any one time, and you can communicate with it like a human, not a machine. It includes everything from the ability to summarize message notifications and float important alerts to the top of the stack, to actually performing actions for you within apps by tapping into app intents. And of course, there are the typical bits of AI candy like cutesy image generation and custom emoji combinations as well. But before we dig any deeper, it's worth saying this distinction between artificial intelligence and Apple Intelligence is not just a consequence of Apple's ego or hubris. Let's be honest, AI as a term has had kind of a bad rap lately. This is the technology being used by bad actors to spread misinformation in deepfake videos online, and to spoof voices by scammers over the phone, and which may well be about to take your job. And even when it is used with good-ish intentions, you'll still sometimes catch it telling you to put glue on your pizza or eat at least one small rock per day. What many people think of as AI today is messy, morally dubious, and often fundamentally untrustworthy. As the counterbalance to that, Apple Intelligence wants to differentiate itself in the minds of Apple's customers with AI that's reliable, private, and secure, as opposed to the wild west of generative AI elsewhere. Craig Federighi called it AI for the rest of us, but reading between the lines, you might think of it as AI you can actually trust, or alternatively, AI without the BS. The recent example of Google's botched AI overviews launch in search and its gluey pizza advice is exactly the kind of thing Apple will be hoping to avoid with Apple Intelligence, hence staking its very brand name on Apple's AI being different. Being AI you can trust also extends to how your personal data is processed, which is why we were treated to a lengthy WWDC keynote segment on private cloud compute. Apple Intelligence will process everything locally when it can, but when your AI request needs extra processing power of the cloud, Apple can do that while protecting your privacy at the same time. The suggestion here, of course, is that Google in particular can't be trusted to get its AI on with your personal data. In any case, it's easy to look at the typical generative AI stuff like rewriting emails to sound less passive-aggressive or generating cute little animations of your friends on their birthday and say, oh, now Apple is just doing a bunch of stuff that I've seen elsewhere before. That's the natural response when you see Apple straight up copying things like Gmail's Smart Reply feature. But years from now, I think what's really going to stand out as the most important feature in iOS 18 is the way this AI is baked in at the OS level, the way Siri is aware of what's on your screen and can act accordingly, and can even hop into apps and do things for you, and while doing all that, have the general intelligence and personal knowledge to hopefully not make any mistakes while doing so. Now, a lot of this is stuff Google has been flirting with for quite some time, and actually in Android 15, Google Gemini will be aware of what's on your screen as well. And Google's miniaturized LLM, Gemini Nano, was seen enabling some quite similar features during its I/O 2024 keynote. But Apple's vision is just as ambitious, if not more so. The vision of AI being enabled throughout the OS to help with everything from setting camera modes to updating contact details, acting as a bouncer for your notification center, and letting you know when a bumped meeting might cause problems for your plans elsewhere. If it works well enough, and sure that's a big if right now, it could change the way we think about interacting with the most personal computer in our lives, in the same way that the move from the command line systems like DOS to a graphical user interface was a fundamental change in how people used computers back in the day. That might sound like hyperbole, but if Apple's right about how well this stuff is going to work, I don't think it's unrealistic. But this being Apple, there is also the element of ecosystem lock-in to consider. Although Apple isn't selling your personal data, and will tell you that very loudly, that data and the connections it enables through Apple AI is still part of what ties you to iOS. And should you move over to Android, those connections go up in smoke along with your iMessages, health history, and of course, most of the rest of your personal info. And that's true even though, finally, iOS 18 will see the introduction of RCS support for richer cross-platform messaging. But iOS 18 isn't all lock-in and anti-competition. In fact, Apple isn't ruling out bringing Google's Gemini or other AI models to iOS at some point in future. Right now, ChatGPT will be baked into iOS 18 as well as other Apple products and available for free with the most advanced GPT 4o model. But it's best to think of this as the default LLM in the same way that Safari might be your default browser. When you want to take advantage of GPT, Siri asks you if it's okay to proceed and presents the appropriate warning. The prompt there could just as easily be for Gemini in future if Apple and Google want to make that happen. Obviously, content generated by ChatGPT or whatever other model might live here is given the appropriate safety warning. And a couple of big consequences of Apple Intelligence stand out to me. Firstly, just as some folks are saying that smartphone tech has plateaued, that phones have become boring, I think this AI tech is potentially going to be one of the reasons why you might want a flagship smartphone, or Apple would hope a flagship iPhone, in your pocket going into the later part of this decade. Plus, if all this functionality already lives in your phone, then it's also hard to see the market for an additional wearable AI gadget that doesn't have the same hooks into the OS as Apple Intelligence. Right now though, unfortunately you can't try out Apple Intelligence in the initial iOS 18 developer preview. And even after it launches in beta this summer, it looks like there'll be a waitlist and it'll be limited to US English. That's obviously a shame because it's the single most important feature, or rather suite of features in this new version. In the Photos app, for example, where Apple Intelligence promises new intelligent search features, similar to what Google demoed at I/O, in addition to features like background object erasure, similar to Magic Editor on Google's Pixel phones, none of that stuff is currently live. The iOS 18 beta pretty much just has some of the new UI elements that were shown off at WWDC, but none of the cool stuff. You'll also need one of Apple's most expensive iPhones to use Apple Intelligence when it arrives. Currently, only the iPhone 15 Pro series with their A17 Pro chips are quick enough to run the new AI tricks. Whether the new baseline non-Pro iPhone 16s will get Apple Intelligence is an open question, because Apple's naming scheme here definitely leaves some room open for a non-Pro A17, perhaps with less RAM to power that phone, possibly also without AI support, so we'll have to wait and see. Besides which, what you can try out in iOS 18 today are the new visual options for the home screen. You can switch to large icons without labels, and there are some new options for icon backgrounds in dark mode as well. Plus, the tinted color options seem to take some inspiration from Google's Material U on its Pixel phones, letting you choose a matching or complementary color for your app icons. Oh, and you can now move your icons and widgets anywhere as opposed to having them stacked from the top of the screen. Between this and the new icon theming options, it seems there's a lot of Android influence going into this latest version of the iOS home screen. And in fact, Ars Technica's Ron Amadeo brings up one such historical comparison here. Pretty funny to see this arriving now as opposed to, any point in the past 15 years. Meanwhile, the ability to hide and lock certain apps catches iOS up to where many Android skins already were. A similar deal with scheduled messaging in iMessage 2, which the competition has had for some time already. I will say the addition of satellite messaging in iMessage is a big deal though, especially considering how none of Apple's competitors have really gotten their satellite communication efforts off the ground. There's also a comprehensive overhaul for the Control Center, which, thanks to the new Controls APIs, is now more customizable than ever, with resizable, rearrangeable buttons and a 4-stage swipeable menu that incorporates media controls, a second section for network-related toggles, and an overflow area for additional controls. The new Controls API means the shortcuts on your lock screen can also be customized in the same way, while opening up more options for the Action key on iPhone 15 Pro models as well. So this is definitely a more personalizable iOS, even if the core visuals aren't changing all that much. Changes to the Fitness app will also allow you to feed back information on the intensity of your workouts and track your vitals over time, stepping on the toes of many apps like Athletics. And now rest days are supported without breaking your streaks, a long-requested feature that means you don't need to cheat by temporarily setting lower goals when you're sick or injured. There are some obligatory Sherlockings too, with the introduction of a dedicated passwords app that ties into your keychain info, as you can see in this nice little bit of B-roll here showing all my passwords. And the new iPhone screen mirroring feature is also surely bad news for at least a couple of smaller developers, as Apple brings the ability to remotely control your phone even without turning the screen on with iOS 18 and the new macOS Sequoia, such is the nature of new iOS versions. The last big fundamental iOS overhaul came with iOS 7 back in 2013. Even that was mainly visual, casting off the skeuomorphic shackles of earlier versions. iOS 18 may look more or less the same as previous versions on the surface, but with Apple Intelligence, it's going to be the biggest change to the way you can use your iPhone, arguably ever, with a private AI that's both helpful in the background and indispensable when you need to directly ask for its assistance. So stick around, be sure to subscribe for full coverage of Apple Intelligence, iOS 18, and the iPhone 16 series when it lands later this year. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.